Last time we talked about how Aquarium's cello player by the name of Seva Gaikel created one of the most cult clubs in history of Russian music called TaMtAm. We also talked about some of the key bands that performed at the club, including Tequila Jazz, Chimera, and Knife Frau Müller. So, if you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend checking it out first and then continuing to watch this video afterwards. Now, last time we looked into bands that played more demanding, heavy music such as post-hardcore and noise rock. Although the club was mostly associated with bands such as Chimera and Knife Frau Müller, there was a lot more happening in the small rundown building than one might first think. Practically all the big alternative communities in St. Petersburg were present in TaMtAm at some point. In fact, these communities were so big that Seva Gaikel would organize specific days for alternative genres present at the club. One thing united all the bands, whether heavy or not: these artists didn't hold any old bands from the Soviet past on a pedestal. They were dismantling the cult of personality that some Soviet artists previously had. Perhaps a good beginning would be the massive punk crowd. Last time we talked about the more artsy bands, but there were people who wanted something more straightforward from their Russian music. One of the most fun bands at TaMtAm was the Pauki. Pauki played fast-paced, high-energy hardcore and skate punk, with occasional post-punk and folk-punk song in between. One of the things that set the band apart were the themes and imagery in the music. The band distanced themselves away from cliché lyrics about hating the government and riots in the streets, instead writing songs about adventures, pirates, haunted houses, and drinking beer. Although for some it might seem silly, the combination of these adventurous, fun themes with fast-paced punk music goes surprisingly well. The band became a cult sensation in St. Petersburg to the point that the Pauki would later open up for UK legends The Exploited. Pauki's brand of fantasy and pirate punk turned out to be successful and influential. One band that in a way continued Pauki's doings in TaMtAm was Korol. Originally, Korol played comfy acoustic rock under the band name Kantora. Soon, they would pick up electric guitars and start playing in TaMtAm. Korol also focused on catchy punk rock melodies, however they had a much more commercial appeal than the already mentioned Pauki. While the Pauki would take the listeners across the globe with their stories and settings, Korol utilized a stronger Russian folk feel in their lyrics and imagery.
я возьму их себе. Так они будут на мне.
For those people who came to TaMtAm in order to cool down from the problems of ordinary life, there was Solus Rex, one of Russia's first dream pop and ethereal wave bands. Sadly, the band only has one known recording, but it's a great piece of early 90s alternative music. Solus Rex was one of the first bands in TaMtAm to start singing in English. Singing in English and generally distancing away from Russian lyrics was another cultural shift that TaMtAm was responsible for. At a time when most Russian journalists were more interested in the political context of a song than the actual music, singing in English was an easy way to distance yourself from this sort of representation in media. One of my favorite bands from TaMtAm was Wine. This band might be one of the most unjustly forgotten bands of the entire St. Petersburg scene. Wine's sound was a mix of 60s psychedelia and carefree 70s glam rock melodies. The band was heavily influenced by music that came from the UK. As a result, some people online have started calling Wine the first Britpop band in Russia, but I think that is a bit of a stretch.
Understand why she called herself me. I left my house and land, I left my merry England, just to find some steady job to maintain my true love.
Some bands would give up on writing lyrics in general, instead utilizing the Cocktail Twins method and making up their own language. One such band was Dva Samolyota. Dva Samolyota is quite an old band whose roots go back to the Soviet Union. The band was even included in the Leningrad rock club circle. However, Dva Samolyota's eccentric out there mix of world music and alternative rock fit perfectly under the format of the newly opened TaMtAm club. Another noticeable band was Lukkoye, who played an interesting mix of progressive folk, tribal ambient, and psychedelia. One of the most cult and interesting TaMtAm bands to my ear was Skazy Lesa. This band played very creative and interesting type of folk punk that managed to be both very fun and happy, but also really dark and sad when needed. In a way, Skazy Lesa was continuing to develop the sound started by Fyodor Chestikov and his Soviet folk punk band Nol. One interesting thing to note is that at one point the band's drummer was none other than Eduard Starkov of Chimera fame.
Зашла на небе полная луна, она с тобою знает все она. Все знает, но только вот молчит, молчит, ничего не говорит. Это я! Это ты!
For those people who wanted something darker and more industrial oriented, there was Monumент Stracha. Although the band didn't leave many recordings behind, they could be of interest to lovers of lo-fi weirdo Russian music, such as Stereo Zoldat or Die Schwarzen Katzen, for example. Stories of an underground club in St. Petersburg started spreading across Russia and neighboring countries. Performing in TaMtAm was not exactly a badge of honor, but definitely a sign that a band deserves people's attention. One such band is Kangaroo, a band that originally was from the city of Penza, perhaps one of the most original and unique Russian bands from the early 90s. Kangaroo mixed psychedelia with Russian folk music, reggae, medieval music, and much more. If you're a fan of bands such as Pekin Ro Ro, Auktion, Zvuki Mu, you must give Kangaroo a chance. This is one of the coolest underground finds of the decade.
Тихо плещется река, но река-то глубока, а есть места не глубоко, но места те далеко. И на той стороне реки, где все время рыбаки, а смутно, но видна, ходит девушка одна. Добычу в воде, над водой эта птица кружится. И вот что-то тихо плывет по воде, но ей в пищу оно не годится. И вот что-то тихо плывет по воде, но ей в пищу оно не годится.
By the mid-90s, bands from the TaMtAm club started traveling across Europe and post-Soviet states in order to promote their music. One of the most popular destinations was Germany, and one of the most successful tours was done by Chimera. According to some rumors I found online, these shows would be attended by the best of German underground bands from the 90s, including members of bands such as Rammstein, for example. Chimera would even release a split with a German underground band called Stein für den Frieden.
Stehen sich auch sehr gut darauf, Ska-Musik zu machen, wie zum Beispiel die Band Spitfire aus St. Petersburg.
Another band that had a good time in Germany was Spitfire. Spitfire played catchy ska punk, which was popular in the 90s. Unlike most of their TaMtAm peers, Spitfire had all the potential of achieving commercial success, since their music was fairly straightforward, fun, and devoid of avant-garde Russian roots. Had Spitfire tried really hard, I could see them becoming a mildly successful band in the US, with a couple of tracks ending up in 90s teen shows like Daria and Tony Hawk Pro Skater games. As already mentioned, the infamous TaMtAm club was gaining more traction by the day. Now you could see big name artists show up at the club. One person who visited TaMtAm a couple of times was, for example, David Byrne of Talking Heads fame. Although there was more freedom in the country, obtaining underground tapes and records from abroad was still somewhat hard. As a result, some bands were stuck in a weird loophole where they knew something was happening in the world, but they didn't know exactly what. Such was the case with the hardcore punk band Marradyory. The band's leader, Ilya Marradyor, would read about a fresh new genre called hardcore punk in a music magazine. Ilya had never heard any Western hardcore punk band, but the description of the genre got him inspired to try it out, with the magazine's description to go off as the main source. Later, Ilya would finally get the chance to hear the DRI and Black Flag albums people were raving about. Surprisingly, he managed to achieve a really similar sound thanks to his big imaginations from reading. '90s Russia also meant open borders and a new flow of people from other countries. This would include people from various parts of the world, including Western Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean islands. A lot of these people were students. These students would interact with the Russian youth, forming friendships and attempting to create music together. Streets of St. Petersburg were taken over by the sounds of roots reggae, dub, and ska music. Underground clubs such as TaMtAm became the go-to place to hear this sort of music live with as much authenticity kept intact. One of the bands that always rocked the stage whilst performing at TaMtAm was Markscheider Kunst. This band was formed by students at the Gorny University. The band's main frontman was Selenge Makangila, also known as Seraphim. Seraphim was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo and raised on traditional Congolese music called sokas. Markscheider Kunst's music was quite original in my opinion, a mix of Jamaican reggae, ska, Congolese sokas music, and American acid rock and jam band stuff. When I listen to Markscheider Kunst, I am reminded of the creative Zamrock bands from the 1970s. Markscheider Kunst would make a great impression on various international festivals, apparently even getting praise from the legendary band Mano Negra at some point. For fans of dub and spaced out reggae, there was Caribace. Caribace's music was always chilled out and cool. The band's two main musicians were Filip Nikanorov and Dmitry Vasilyev, who were bonded by their love for Bob Marley's music. Similarly to Markscheider Kunst, Caribace gained a good reputation abroad. The band would appear at various international festivals in Europe and even work with the legendary Lee Scratch Perry. Another interesting reggae figure at the time was Dr. Aybalit, a friend of Seraphim and Markscheider Kunst. If you don't know how Dr. Aybalit looks, you could easily put his music on an underground late 70s roots reggae compilation, straight from Jamaica.
So many problems in material world, tragedies out of me, no one with us. Look into the sky, meditate and pray. I worship like the drum, only reggae play. We are the people who want. Oh, we are the people who want. We are the people who master. We are the people who master. Oh, we are the people who try.
There were other bands who played music in a similar vein, but we have to move on for now. Another interesting band from TaMtAm was Ниагара, a mix of depressing post-punk with industrial and art rock elements. I see the band as a sort of precursor to the Russian music that would start developing in the early to mid 2000s. The recordings that the band had left are of low quality, but that sort of adds a underground charm to them, in my personal opinion. Due to TaMtAm's popularity, a small split started forming between bands that belonged to TaMtAm and those who merely played a couple of shows there. Although this might sound dumb or weird, what I mean is that there were bands who were heavily linked to the TaMtAm sound, philosophy, and aesthetics, and then there were other bands who played a couple of shows but belonged to other scenes, eras, and clubs. An example of a TaMtAm band would be someone like Chimera or the countless groups that appeared on the TaMtAm compilations from the 1990s. An example of a band that played in TaMtAm would be someone like Aukcion or Chuda Yuda. Aukcion wasn't a TaMtAm band because they were older and belonged to the Leningrad rock club era, and Chuda Yuda was based in Moscow. Speaking of Moscow, TaMtAm's environment was quite the cultural shock for some artists from the Russian capital. Although my video mostly focuses on the music, the environment is really important in understanding what TaMtAm was. The actual environment surrounding TaMtAm in the mid-90s was grimy to say the least. Starting with the fact that TaMtAm not only became a shelter for music nerds but also one of the easiest places to obtain various sorts of narcotics. And we're not talking about a little bit of Mary Jane here and there. Mix heavy drugs, alcohol beverages, weird angry music, and a crowd of energetic Russian teens, and you have a cocktail that will cause big problems. Fights, provocation from gopniks, and worst of all, raids by the police became a regular occasion at the TaMtAm. Psychobilly themed nights were the absolute worst when it came to the atmosphere at the club. The crowd that came to see these bands were mad lads of the extreme kind. This was no peaceful Markscheider Kunst concert. Someone getting hurt was practically guaranteed. This is how Moscow's Dmitry Spirin, lead singer of the commercial pop-punk band Tarakana, described the TaMtAm club. It was a scary and dark place that could never exist in Moscow under any circumstances. The club was located on the Vasilyevsky Island in a shady, narrow St. Petersburg neighborhood, in an unheated, wind-swept large room. It was very uncomfortable, at least for us guys from Moscow. The crowd resembled angry bulls that for some reason decided to dress up in punk attire and grow out the hair. All of them looked very unfriendly and aggressive, which, coupled with the dark walls and unhappy entourage, created an oppressive atmosphere. The atmosphere was unfriendly. You could feel it in every stare and movement. You started thinking that at any second these people would turn into monsters and start eating each other. When I hear about the great days of TaMtAm, from tequila jazz and Markscheider Kunst, I'm simply baffled. During November of '93, TaMtAm was a real cloaca where people sold acid at the front doors, lobby, main halls, bathrooms, and staircases. I saw people with syringes that were like 20 cubic centimeters long, giving doses to other people straight to the mouth. Nobody even thought about any sort of safety precautions. Started getting the impression that PCP was legalized in St. Petersburg. Just think about it, the sour stuff costs less than vodka there. Narcotics didn't make these people any softer or more relaxed. They would take PCP as if it was vodka and simply get high from each other in a dark way. I think what I described is enough to understand where the roots come from for a lot of St. Petersburg bands. This city puts a print that you can't wash off. TaMtAm was a natural St. Petersburg creation, a devilish and nightmarish creation. I have to point out that these are words said by one person, and this might not be pure truth. Upon checking out an old VK discussion surrounding experienced words, I have found comments from people who used to go to TaMtAm that say that they never experienced the same things that Spirin described here. There were also comments about how Tarakana were booed off stage and not liked in TaMtAm, so there's a possibility Spirin is making everything sound worse than it really is, but still, I think this is an interesting description of the place that shines light on the club in a different way. As a result of TaMtAm's reputation surrounding drugs and violence, police raids started happening very frequently. The police would act very aggressively with the punks in the club. A lot of people would leave the club in handcuffs or bruisers. TaMtAm started causing more problems than good for Gawkin, and the outside pressure to close down the place was getting to him and other people working at the club. The club known as TaMtAm closed down on the 22nd of April 1996. Spontaneously, just as the club was created, it was closed. Although nowadays the closing of TaMtAm adds to the legendary status of the place, back then frequent TaMtAm goers were really bummed out. Apparently some people even started petitions to keep the place open, but the whole thing turned out to be pointless. TaMtAm existed for only 5 years, but that was enough for it to become the most cult and remembered club in all of Russian independent music history. There are a plethora of reasons for that, some good and some that a group of people would consider bad. By the time TaMtAm closed down, Russia was slowly moving into a new cultural era. Soviet pop and rock artists have been moved to the side by new hip Russian pop stars and commercially friendly rock bands. Russian show business finally got a new flow of money and blood that was needed in the early 90s. A new level of professional quality emerged, one that arguably, of course, could be considered to be on a higher level. All of this was great and all, but how did TaMtAm bands fit into all of this? Prior to the closing of TaMtAm, most of these bands made very rare appearances on the radio and even less frequent appearances on TV. This is where the paths for many TaMtAm bands begin to split. Bands with a higher commercial appeal, such as Korol for example, would find themselves easily merging with the mainstream rock bands heard on stations such as Nasha Radio. By the late 90s and early 2000s, the band was one of the most popular mainstream punk and alternative bands in the country. The band would become really popular with young kids. Korol issued merchandise sold out better than any other modern Russian rock band at the time. As a result of this new commercial success, the band was dismissed by other fellow St. Petersburg and Russian punk artists. The common music snob consensus is that the band's debut is aight, but everything that followed is too commercial, fake punk, and all that type of stuff. Tequila Jazz would get by for a couple of years working with other St. Petersburg bands, such as Calibri, and also composing music for Russian indie films. Out of all the bands to come out of TaMtAm, Tequila Jazz was the one to mature lyrically and musically the most. As a result of this, Tequila Jazz became darlings of the Russian music press. Well, at least that portion that didn't suffer from bad cases of self-hatred at least. The band's third album, Celluloid, had a softer sound. one that had potential radio appeal. However, Fedorov did not want to be associated with the mainstream Russian radio rock at the time, and as a result showed absolute disinterest in becoming another poster child for the Marradyory generation.
Море звука и в море света, и просто в море бирюзового цвета. Всего 5 нот, ни припева, ни куплета, но послушайте мелодию эту. Зависит от того, сколько мне и для чего мы потратили на этот мост. После долгого дождя нам осталось все, но кроме звезд. Да-да-да. Кто отделит зимнее солнце в небе, как на флаге японцев, желтые лучи дымом от печи.
Perhaps as a result of this need to move away from mainstream alternative music, the band's fourth album, 150 миллиардов шагов, turned out to be way more complex, experimental, and commercially unappealing. By this point, Tequila Jazz had completely gotten rid of their alternative metal and rock past, now heading towards music that was closer to something resembling progressive rock. The band's fifth album, Vyше Oseni, saw the prog elements turned up even more, along with the track length increasing in places. By then you could say that Tequila Jazz had successfully dodged the show business trap while remaining popular with a large group of Russian music fans. Ilya Nikitin, aka Ilya Marradyor, would dismantle his hardcore punk band Marradyory and formed Port 812. Port 812 played catchy pop and skate punk, similar to something off the Crazy Taxi or Tony Hawk games. This was a really jarring decision that left a lot of previous Marradyory colleagues and fans puzzled, but thanks to Ilya's abilities to write catchy hooks and humorous, easygoing, self-deprecating character, he is still greatly respected by the punk and alternative rock crowd. One of the most bizarre changes happened to Knife Frau Müller. At some point hooked up on electronics brought by Brian Eno himself, yes, Brian Eno visited St. Petersburg frequently during the 90s and even had a house there apparently, the band managed to change their sound completely, going from noisy no-wave and crust-punk to light-hearted comedic electronic tunes with elements of surf rock, space-age pop, trip-hop, and plunderphonics.
Лучшая девушка в СССР.
О, спасибо, данкишен.
The band's sound was quite unique due to the use of Soviet cinema and music when it came to the sample material. Later, members of the band would split and the project Messer Chups would be created. This project was based in Germany, perhaps some of you have even heard of it. Many bands would continue existing with various degrees of success, such as Skazy Lesa, Markscheider Kunst, and the Pauki. Sadly, not all bands managed to survive this change. A lot of cult groups such as Jugendstil, for example, would soon stop releasing new music and playing concerts. However, the saddest outcome, and one that was highly symbolic of TaMtAm's end, was the fate of Chimera. There is some conflicting evidence and the topic is really touchy, so I will try my best to explain the situation while being as formal and respectful as possible. Eduard Starkov would start traveling back to Viperi where he would play with other bands, one of whom was the alternative rock band Последние танки в Париже. Back in St. Petersburg, Chimera was given a place to rehearse, by Sevagakil, who was still interested in the band and wanted to help them on their way. Eduard's past friends started noticing changes in Eduard's character. The thing that brought out a lot of concern was Eduard's drug use and new friendships formed as a result of this lifestyle choice. These were dangerous, shady and violent people that could have contributed to the negative environment Eduard found himself in. We bought a bottle of vodka and drank it at a place that belonged to some creeps. These people have stooped to the point that they were eating dogs. Red was living with horrible people back then. They were completely mad. One of these guys came up to me with a knife and said, "You're only here because you are Red's friend." One day after a gig, Eduard went missing. Although people felt like something was wrong, his absence was attributed to the drug usage and new company Eduard found himself in. On February 23rd, 1997, Eduard Starkov was found dead by hanging in his room at Chimera's practice spot. Starkov was only 27 years old. The body of TaMtAm's greatest artist was found by Sevagakil. Chimera disbanded after the passing of Eduard Starkov. Chimera became a symbol of the Russian underground and DIY culture. The band never made it on the mainstream radio, and it's rare for Chimera to appear in a fancy retrospective episode or article about 90s Russian music. But for those people who genuinely care about quality Russian music, Chimera stands above a large portion of bands from that time. A tribute album dedicated to Chimera called Totalny Jazz, which is one of Chimera's songs, was released in 2006. Some TaMtAm era bands play Chimera songs live as a sign of respect and love to this day, and the reaction they receive from the crowd proves how timeless Starkov's message and music really was. The shutting down of TaMtAm was the end of the first chapter in St. Petersburg's underground music history, but it wasn't the end. There were other clubs, movements and sub-scenes that would be formed after that. As for TaMtAm, I think we have covered this era of Russian music enough for now. Sadly, I haven't found a lot of information on TaMtAm in English, but if you're a Russian speaker or are in the process of learning the language, I highly recommend the documentary TaMtAm Muzika Smutного Времени by the Kruschevka channel. There you get more detailed knowledge about the club's formation and music with interviews from a lot of the key figures at the place. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Feel free to correct any mistakes you found in the video, list your favorite bands, share interesting facts about TaMtAm. I will see you in the next episode of the Eastern Archives. Thank you very much.